The church was cold, as April churches always were in that part of Wiltshire, stone walls holding winter long past its welcome, while the world outside arranged itself in blossom and birdsong and the pretense of warmth. Cecily Marsden stood in the narthex and did not look at the doors. She had been standing there for 11 minutes. She knew because the verger's clock above the vestry ticked in a register she could feel in her back teeth, and she had been counting each beat since her mother pressed the orange blossoms into her hair and said, for the 4th time that morning, Dorothea would have wanted this. The gown was ivory silk, cut in the new style with a high waist and a train that swept the stone floor in a way that the seamstress had declared charming and that Cecily found only burdensome because it was not her gown. It had been Dorothea's gown. Dorothea, who had ordered the silk from a mercer in Bath, and overseen 3 fittings, and died of a fever 6 weeks before she was to become the Countess of Ashcroft. The ring Cecily wore on her left hand was also Dorothea's. Her mother had pressed it on with the kind of efficiency that admits of no discussion. The whispers from inside the church were not quiet enough to miss. She had not expected them to be. The season knew about the substitution, because the season always knew. And the Marsden family's creditors had made certain the season understood the financial architecture of the arrangement before any formal announcement had been circulated. Dorothea Marsden had been promised to the Earl of Ashcroft as part of a settlement that would save Marsden Park from sale. Dorothea had died. The settlement remained. The name on the settlement read Marsden. The whisper closest to the door said, "She could pass, in the Vale." The whisper behind it said, "She is nothing like Dorothea." Cecily breathed in. She breathed out. She adjusted the veil, which was also Dorothea's, and thought about how a woman could wear another woman's name like a coat, borrowed from someone taller, always pulling at the shoulders, always a little wrong at the hem. She did not think about the Earl of Ashcroft, because thinking about the Earl of Ashcroft required more steadiness than she possessed at present. She had met him once, at the formal introduction 4 months ago at Ashcroft House, before Dorothea had fallen ill. She had stood 3 feet behind her sister and noted the set of his jaw, the stillness he brought into a room, and the way his eyes had moved once toward Cecily, and held there a beat too long before returning to his intended. She had decided then that she did not like him, and had been careful since not to examine that decision too closely. The church doors opened. Her father offered his arm. She took it. The nave stretched before her, candlelit on either side despite the gray April light coming through the high windows, perhaps 3 dozen guests arranged in the pews, with the particular stillness of people observing something they are not certain they approve of, but intend to witness nonetheless. Cecily kept her eyes forward. She was aware of the organ, playing something solemn and slightly mournful, and she was aware of the altar ahead. And she was aware that the man standing at the altar had not looked up at the doors when they opened, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. He was looking at the floor in front of him, or perhaps at something else entirely, something interior and private. He wore his dark coat with the ease of a man who had never in his life been uncomfortable in formal dress, and his shoulders were still, and one gloved hand rested at his side with a looseness that suggested he was controlling it quite deliberately. He looked up when she was 10 feet away. She saw his face change. It was not the change she had braced for, the recoil, the flash of displeasure, the cold recalculation. It was something quieter and more difficult to name, something that moved through him like a current, through still water, visible only in the slight adjustment of his posture, the particular quality of attention that replaced whatever private thought had been occupying him a moment before. His eyes, which were gray in the candlelight, did not leave her face. She knew it. with the precision of someone who has been watching a man's face. He knew. Of course he knew. He had met Dorothea 17 times across 2 seasons. He had always known. She took her place beside him, and the ceremony began. The Reverend Stanton was a man who had been performing marriages in this church for 22 years and had learned to speak with a deliberate, unhurried pace that Cecily usually found comforting and today found nearly unbearable. She repeated the responses when prompted. Her voice was steady. She had decided in the narthex that her voice would be steady, and she was grateful that her body had honored that decision. At the words "I do," the Earl of Ashcroft's hand tightened, once and briefly, around hers. She looked at him. He was looking at Reverend Stanton, his profile composed and unreadable, but the hand around hers did not relax. The pressure was not punishing. It was something else. Something that she could not translate while standing in a church in her dead sister's gown. And so she did not try. The ceremony ended. They walked down the nave together. The whispers on either side were not whispering anymore, or perhaps they were, and she had stopped being able to hear them because the Earl of Ashcroft had offered her his arm, and the arrangement of his hand over hers on that arm was so careful, so deliberate, so precisely calibrated to public propriety that it communicated something that a less restrained man would have said aloud. She did not know what that something was. In the carriage, they did not speak for nearly 3 miles. She had prepared remarks for the silence, sensible things about the estate designed to establish cordial distance. She had the first ready at her lips and did not say it because he turned from the window and spoke first. "Cecily," he said. "Not Miss Marsden. Not my lady," which was technically now correct. Her name, plain and unadorned, spoken in a voice that was lower than she had remembered from their single meeting 4 months ago. She looked at him. His expression was level, which she recognized now as a register. He used the way other men used volume, the constraint itself as information. "You will find the arrangements at Ashcroft House adequate," he said. "The south wing has been prepared. You will have full use of the library and the morning room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, will answer any household question. I ask only one thing of you." She waited. "Honesty," he said, "from this day forward. Whatever else we are or are not to each other, I would like us to be honest." The carriage moved. Outside, Wiltshire arranged itself in the pale green of its early April self, hedgerows and stone walls, and Cecily Marsden, now by law the Countess of Ashcroft, felt something shift behind her sternum that she had not expected to feel on this day. "I did not ask for this," she said. "I know." "My mother, the settlement. There was not." She stopped, began again. "I want you to understand that I did not present myself as Dorothea. My name was put forward. I was told that the arrangement superseded individual, that the name Marsden was what the settlement required. I know that also." "Then what?" she said. "Is it you need me to be honest about?" He looked at her for a moment, that gray, unreadable look, and she thought she saw something flicker at the edge of it. Not unkindness, nothing like unkindness, but something very old and very private, a room that had been shut for a long time. "About this," he said. He meant the carriage. He meant the gown she was wearing. He meant the 11 minutes she had spent in the narthex and the question she had not permitted herself to think about. "About what you wish for, and what you do not. I have had enough of arrangements made in my name without my knowledge to last several lifetimes. I do not wish to make one of you." She looked out the window. "I wished," she said quietly, "to be myself. I have been wishing it for some time. He said nothing. He turned back to the window. If you had been watching, had happened to be seated across from them in that carriage, you would have seen two composed people looking at the Wiltshire countryside with expressions of determined neutrality, and you would have missed, entirely, the moment when his gloved hand moved 2 inches across the seat toward hers and stopped. She did not miss it. If you have come this far with me, stay close. What comes next costs more than either of them expected. Ashcroft House was larger than she had allowed herself to imagine. Because imagining it had felt like a concession to a future she was not certain she would be permitted to inhabit. The facade was pale stone, Georgian in its proportions, 3 stories with the particular symmetry that suggests long-settled confidence rather than new money's ambition. The park stretched behind it toward a ha-ha and a stand of oaks that had been there, the coachman said without being asked, since before the first King George. Mrs. Farrow was waiting at the steps, a compact woman of 50 with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had formed opinions and had not yet decided whether to share them. She curtsied precisely. "My lady," she said. The title landed on Cecily like something she had not quite braced for, which was absurd, because she had had the full duration of the ceremony to prepare for it. And yet there it was, a small stone in the center of her chest. "Mrs. Farrow," she said, "I am glad to meet you." Something shifted in Mrs. Farrow's face, barely perceptible. Not quite warmth, but the possibility of it. The house showed itself the way large houses do, one room leading to the next, each carrying its own weight of beeswax and old paper, and the kind of settled prosperity that takes generations to accumulate. The library occupied the west wing. 3 walls of shelves, floor to ceiling, a fire already lit despite the fact that April did not strictly require it, and at the far end a writing desk with a view of the garden below. On the desk, a small painting in a worn gilt frame, not large enough to be formal portrait work, the kind of thing a man carries in his breast pocket on long journeys and sets somewhere visible when he arrives. A young woman's face, fair-haired, a slight upturn to the nose, an expression of warm mischief. Cecily recognized the mischief. She had seen it every day of her life. She stood in front of the small painting for a long time, alone, because Mrs. Farrow had correctly read the room and withdrawn. Dorothea had been 21. She had laughed at the portrait sitting because the artist had tried to render her solemn, and she had found solemnity funny. She had approached her engagement with the same warm practicality she applied to everything, expecting to be fond of him in time and trusting that fondness would be sufficient. Cecily wondered what Dorothea would have made of the hand on the carriage seat. She wondered what she was supposed to make of the hand on the carriage seat. She was still wondering this when footsteps sounded in the corridor, and the Earl of Ashcroft appeared in the doorway of the library, and went very still when he saw her standing in front of the portrait. The quality of his stillness was different from his public composure. It was the stillness of a man who has walked into a room and found something he did not expect to find, and is deciding, very rapidly, how to speak about it. "She gave it to me herself," he said. "Last October, at the Hendersons' dinner. She said I ought to have something to remember her face by during the long months until the wedding." Cecily turned. "She was like that," she said. "Practical about sentiment." "Yes." A pause. "She was not what I expected." "What had you expected?" He looked at the painting, not at her. "Someone who needed managing. Her mother gave me to understand that Dorothea required a steadying influence, that her spirits were high and her judgment occasionally uneven. I found instead a woman of considerable sense who had simply learned to disguise it as high spirits, because that was more convenient for everyone around her." Cecily felt something tight in her throat. "She did that," she said. "She was very good at giving people what they needed to believe about her. He looked at her now. It was the same look from the altar, that gray current, patient and very precise. "Are you good at it also?" he asked. She thought of the narthex. She thought of her prepared remarks in the carriage. She thought of the ivory silk gown that was not hers, and the borrowed name that was not hers, and the life she had been handed like a package addressed to someone else. "I used to be better at it," she said. The fire crackled. Outside, the April light was going from gray to gold to gray again, as clouds moved across the sun with the indifference of clouds. "The portrait stays," he said. Not a question. Not quite a command. Something between the two. The syntax of a man who is accustomed to authority, but is, in this particular room, less certain of the ground beneath him. "Of course it stays," Cecily said. He left the room. She did not know why that answer had mattered, but it clearly had, and she did not know what to do with the fact of that knowing. In the days that followed, Ashcroft House revealed itself the way people do when they are not performing for guests, in the small specific details of how it ran, where the thin morning light came in, where the cold gathered at corners, what the servants called things when they forgot to use the formal names. Mrs. Farrow, Cecily learned by the third day, had run the household for 9 years since the previous countess's death. She had opinions about the linen cupboard that were, Cecily quickly discovered, entirely correct. And on the 4th morning, Cecily said as much. And something that was definitively warmth appeared in Mrs. Farrow's face. The Earl of Ashcroft was not absent, exactly. He was present in the way that a man who is accustomed to occupying his own house presents himself, at dinner and at breakfast, and occasionally in the corridors between rooms. He said what was necessary and not very much else. He asked twice whether she had everything she needed, and she said yes, and the conversation moved efficiently elsewhere. He rode out each morning. He came back at noon with mud on his boots, and a quality of easier breathing that she recognized as a man whose mind works better when his body is moving. On the 6th morning, she was in the library when he came in, not knowing she was there, heading for the writing desk and stopping when he saw her cross-legged on the window bench, with her shoes on the floor beneath her, and a volume from the lower shelves open in her lap. She looked up. She looked, she was aware, exactly like herself. Not like someone who had spent 5 days calibrating her conduct to the expectations of a household. She had her hair pinned back in the untidy arrangement she used when she was reading seriously. And her feet were bare, because the morning room had been cold, and she had walked across the carpet to the window and simply forgotten to put the shoes back on, and there was a small ink mark at the edge of her left hand from the letter she had been writing to her mother earlier and had set aside in favor of the book. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not move to put the shoes on. "The 4th shelf from the top," he said. An annotated Gilbert White. The prior Lord Ashcroft had opinions about birds that the text did not support, and said so at length in the margins. "Is it good?" "The annotations are," he said. She looked at him. The corner of his mouth had moved, fractionally. It was the smallest possible revision of an otherwise composed expression, and it was, she thought, the most honest thing she had seen on his face since the altar. "Show me which one," she said. The next several minutes were spent among the shelves, which meant proximity, which meant the particular awareness that comes with proximity in a quiet room when you have not yet established what kind of two people you are going to be. He stood close enough that she heard him breathe when he reached for the book, and she was aware of the exact distance between his shoulder and hers in the way she was aware of weather, as something her body registered before her mind found words for it. He handed her the book. Their fingers did not quite touch. She took a small, deliberate breath. "Just one." "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. and moved away and sat at the writing desk. And she returned to the window bench and looked at the annotated white and did not read a single word of it for approximately 10 minutes. The invitation arrived at the end of the second week, a card from Lady Tremaine of Brambleton Hall, inviting the new Countess of Ashcroft to a card party on the following Thursday, with an addendum in a clear and pointed hand, noting that several persons were eager to make the acquaintance of their new neighbor. Cecily read the note and set it down and picked it up again. "Lady Tremaine," she said to Mrs. Farrow, who was reviewing the household accounts at the small table in the morning room. Mrs. Farrow's expression arranged itself into something that was not quite a frown. She was very fond of Miss Dorothea, Mrs. Farrow said, carefully. "I see. She had the girl to Brambleton 3 times last season." A pause. "She is the sort of woman who takes an interest." Cecily understood. Lady Tremaine had taken an interest in the right Marsden daughter, and the wrong one had shown up at the altar, and the card party was the instrument by which this would be clarified to anyone who had not yet received sufficient clarity. She wrote the acceptance with a steady hand and decided to wear the green gown, the one that had been made for her specifically, and fit precisely as intended. The Earl of Ashcroft, informed of the engagement, said only that he would accompany her, and said it with the tone of a man who has made a calculation and landed on a course, and will not be revisited on the subject. She thought about asking what calculation. She did not ask. Brambleton Hall was full by the time they arrived, perhaps 40 people distributed across 2 drawing rooms, the kind of gathering that describes itself as intimate while assembling enough witnesses to ensure that nothing goes unrecorded. Cecily wore the green gown. Her hair was dressed correctly. She was, she knew, perfectly presentable, which was not the same as what Dorothea had been, which was radiant without apparent effort, a quality that belonged to some people by disposition and could not be acquired or borrowed. Lady Tremaine received them at the door with the particular graciousness of a woman who has decided to perform magnanimity while reserving judgment. "Lord Ashcroft?" she said with warmth. Then with something almost warm, "And Lady Ashcroft." With something adjacent to warmth, something that had the shape of warmth and a slightly different temperature. "Lady Tremaine," Cecily said. "What a lovely home." The evening arranged itself the way such evenings do. Cecily moved through the rooms with the composed attention of a woman who has been watching such gatherings since she was 16, and she noted the architecture of the interest, cataloging who looked away when she approached, who welcomed her with the particular kindness that is its own form of condescension, who regarded her with the frank assessment of people who have already formed an opinion and are checking it for accuracy. Mrs. Penderton, who had been a neighbor of the Marsden family in Wiltshire for 30 years, said to the woman beside her, in a voice carried perfectly by the acoustics of the fireplace surround, "She is nothing like Dorothea, of course. Dorothea was the beauty of that family." The woman beside Mrs. Penderton said, "Poor girl, to marry under such circumstances." Cecily, who was 3 feet away examining a watercolor of the Brambleton garden, heard every syllable. She set her expression and moved on. The card room was a relief, insofar as cards require attention, and attention is its own kind of shelter. She was placed at a table with a retired colonel who played with aggressive precision, a young woman named Miss Holt, who played with cheerful inaccuracy and did not appear to care, and Lady Tremaine herself, who played the way she did everything, with the smooth efficiency of long practice. She was winning the third hand when Lady Tremaine said, in a tone calibrated to carry no further than the table, "Dorothea was an exceptional young woman. I hope you are aware of how greatly she was valued." "I am aware," Cecily said. "She had a quality that is." A pause that accomplished considerable work. "Not common." "No," Cecily agreed. "It was not common. I grew up watching it." She laid down her card. I loved her very much. Lady Tremaine looked at her. Whatever she had expected, it had not been this. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, Yes, I imagine you did. The evening continued. When Cecily returned to the drawing room, she found the Earl of Ashcroft near the window, in conversation with a man she did not know, and she watched him from across the room with the particular attention she had been trying not to bring to him, noting the angle of his shoulders, the way he listened, the way his gaze moved, once, across the room and located her, and stilled, and something she could not name passed through his face before he returned to his conversation. She looked away first. She did not know why that felt like conceding something. In the carriage home, she said, Mrs. Penderton called me poor girl within clear earshot. Lady Tremaine reminded me of Dorothea's exceptional qualities 3 separate times. He was quiet for a moment. I know. You were not in the card room. No, but I was told. She looked at him. By whom? Miss Holt. She found me directly after the hand and reported the conversation with considerable accuracy and considerable indignation. The corner of his mouth moved again, that small fractional revision. She is 17 and has not yet learned to be circumspect about expressing her opinions. Cecily thought of Miss Holt's cheerful inaccuracy with the cards, which now looked considerably more like strategy than incompetence. I like her, Cecily said. I thought you might. She looked out the window. The Wiltshire dark moved past, darker than London dark, a quality of country night that she had grown up with and had been, she realized, missing. It will not change, she said. The comparison. Wherever we go, it will be the first thing. Yes. And you knew this when you decided to attend tonight? Yes. She looked at him. Why then? He was quiet for long enough that the carriage had crossed the stone bridge over the stream before he answered. Because, he said, you should not be required to walk into rooms like that alone. She felt the sentence land somewhere very specific in her chest and decided not to examine where. That is, she said carefully, a kind thing to say. It is not kindness, he said, with a directness that was almost startling. It is what is owed. You are still with me, I think. I'm glad of it. What comes next is what this has always been moving toward. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The rhythm of Ashcroft House became something Cecily inhabited, rather than moved through. The morning work of correspondence and household management, the afternoon that was her own, the evenings at dinner where conversation had become, without either of them announcing it, less efficient and more varied, ranging across the natural history of the estate, the books she was reading, his occasional dry assessment of county politics, which she found more interesting than she had expected. He had asked once about her childhood in Wiltshire, and she had answered honestly, including the part about being invisible beside Dorothea, not from resentment, but from the plain factual observation that when a room contains someone as vivid as Dorothea, the room's attention goes there naturally, and she had simply learned to inhabit her invisibility as its own form of occupation. He had looked at her for a long moment after that, and said nothing, and the quality of his looking was something she had filed away without quite knowing why. She was in the garden on a Friday morning, in the part of it that the gardener, Jenks, had apologetically explained had been somewhat neglected since the previous countess's death, when she found the rose bushes. They were not neglected, precisely. They were overgrown, unpruned, the canes arching in the particular direction of things that have been growing without guidance, but they were alive, and there were buds on them, small, hard green fists just beginning to think about opening. She was standing among them, her gloves mud-stained from where she had been clearing the dead growth around the base of the first plant, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to find Mrs. Farrow, and behind Mrs. Farrow, picking their way carefully around the longer grass, two small figures. Children. A girl of perhaps 7, in a yellow dress, who was carrying a basket with the seriousness of someone who has been given an important task and intends to honor it, and a boy of perhaps 4, who was carrying nothing except a very intense expression of concentration, apparently directed at his own feet. Mrs. Farrow said, "Lady Ashcroft, this is Miss Harriet and Master Thomas, Lord Ashcroft's niece and nephew. I should have introduced them sooner." Harriet curtsied, efficiently and with some pride. Thomas looked up from his feet and regarded Cecily with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend. "You are the new Lady Ashcroft," Thomas said. "I am," Cecily said. "Uncle James said you were kind," Thomas said. Mrs. Farrow made a sound. "He said that?" Cecily said. "He said you were kind, and that you read a great deal, and that we were not to pester you about the cats," Thomas said. "The cats," Cecily repeated. "There are 4 cats in the stable yard," Harriet said, with the tone of someone clarifying public record. "Thomas wants to bring one inside. Uncle James has said no." Thomas's expression arranged itself into something philosophical. "I see," Cecily said. "Well," she looked at the basket. "What have you brought?" The basket contained stakes, garden twine, 2 trowels, and a slightly wilted bunch of forget-me-nots that Harriet had tied with a ribbon. "For the roses," Harriet said, with a proprietary air. "They need attention." They spent the next hour in the garden. Cecily showed Harriet how to identify the canes that needed removing and the ones that ought to stay. Thomas was given the task of carrying things, which he performed with great seriousness, and the forget-me-nots were planted in the border around the first rows, Harriet's idea, and they looked, in the way of unexpected things, exactly right. When the Earl of Ashcroft came to collect his niece and nephew for luncheon, Cecily was sitting on the garden bench with Thomas leaning against her arm, almost asleep, and Harriet was explaining the principle of the garden twine to the bush. He stood at the entrance to the walled garden for a moment, taking this in, and she became aware of him before she heard him. The particular quality of his attention, like a change in air pressure, the way a room becomes different when someone enters who is paying close attention to it. He looked at her. Not at the children, not at the garden, at her. She looked back. Something shifted in his face, the same current from the altar and the carriage in the library doorway, but closer to the surface now, less carefully managed. His jaw was not tight. His eyes were not guarded. He looked for a moment like a man who is recognizing something he had stopped believing he would find. And the recognition is both a relief and a thing to be afraid of. Thomas woke up and announced that he was hungry. The moment passed. Or rather, it was folded into the practical management of children and luncheon, which is where most honest moments go. But Cecily carried it with her through the afternoon, like something placed carefully in a coat pocket. Something she was not ready to look at directly, but did not want to lose. The letter from her mother arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the Brambleton gathering, and contained the intelligence that Mr. Carver of Carver and Sons had communicated to her father that the settlement funds had arrived, and that Marsden Park was, accordingly, safe. Her mother had written simply, "We are most grateful, Cecily. Lord Ashcroft has been more than generous, and you have done what was required of you." She folded the letter and sat with it for some time. Done what was required of you. She thought about the garden, and Thomas asleep against her arm, and the annotated white, and the moment in the carriage when a gloved hand had moved 2 inches across a seat. She was still sitting with it, when a knock at the morning room door produced the Earl of Ashcroft, who looked at her expression and said, "Bad news?" "No," she said. "Only, my mother writes that Marsden Park is saved." A pause. He came further into the room, which was not what she had expected. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Yes, of course." She looked at the folded letter. "She says I have done what was required of me." "Ah, it is not wrong," she said. "As a description." He was quiet for a moment. She heard the small sounds of the house around them, the clock in the hall, a door somewhere distant, the absolute ordinary interior life of a place that had not, until recently, contained her. "Cecily," he said. She looked up. "I owe you honesty also," he said, "since I asked it of you." She waited. He moved to the chair across from her, the one nearest the window, and sat in it with the contained authority he brought to most surfaces. And yet he set his hands on his knees in a way that was not authoritative at all. That was, she thought, the position of a man who is about to say something that costs him something. "When the settlement was proposed," he said, "after Dorothea died, I did not agree to it immediately. I agreed to it after your father showed me a letter." She looked at him. "Your letter," he said. "You wrote to him from Wiltshire the week after Dorothea died. You told him that you would not consent to the arrangement, that you did not consider yourself contractually bound by your sister's death, and that he should release Lord Ashcroft from the settlement entirely, rather than offer a substitution that no reasonable man could want." The room was very quiet. "He showed you that?" she said. "He was attempting," the Earl of Ashcroft said, with a dryness that was not quite humor, "to demonstrate that his daughters were well raised." A pause. "He succeeded, although perhaps not in the manner he intended." She did not know what to say. "Why are you telling me this now?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I do not want you to believe that you are here only because your name was written on a document. You are here because I read that letter and made a choice. And I should have told you that before now, and I did not. And I am telling you now." Outside, the Wiltshire afternoon moved through its customary light, the particular gold of mid-spring at 4 o'clock, slanting through the window and catching the edge of his coat and the side of his face, and the specific stillness of a man who has said an honest thing and is waiting to see what it costs him. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held tight. "The wound," she said quietly. "Your first wife." He did not flinch, but the quality of his stillness changed. "She died," he said. 3 years ago. A child that did not survive the birth, and then she did not survive the week after. I was not there. I was in London, attending to an estate matter that could not, I had decided, wait." A pause. "I do not speak of it often." "No," she said. "I imagine not." "It is not," he said with the precision of a man who has thought about this carefully, "that I do not wish to speak of it. It is that when I do, the people to whom I speak it tend to respond in ways that are designed to be comforting, and are, in fact, more for their own discomfort than for mine." Cecily looked at him. "It was not your fault," she said. "I know," he said, "but you carry it as if it were." The very smallest pause. "Yes," he said. She looked at the letter in her lap. She looked at the window. She looked at him. "I carry Dorothea," she said. "Not as guilt. As her. She lived in a way I found astonishing. And she was gone before I was finished watching her. And there is not a day I do not think. There is a thing that would have made her laugh. And reach for her. And she is not there." She stopped. "So I do understand carrying." He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful composure or the fractional revision, but something open, something that had let the surface down and was simply there, present and unguarded. "I believe," he said, "that you do." The clock in the hall counted the silence. Neither of them looked away. She became aware, with the peripheral attention of someone who is attempting very hard not to focus on a particular thing, that he was close, that the room had contracted somewhere between his arrival and this moment into something smaller and more significant, that the light through the window was doing what April light does when it decides to be beautiful, and that his hands were still on his knees and had not moved, and she was quite extraordinarily aware of his hands. "I should," she said, and stopped, because she did not know what she should do, which was not a thought she permitted herself often. He moved one of those hands very slowly across the small space between his chair and hers, and set it over hers where it rested on the folded letter, and held it there, and did not say anything. She felt the warmth of it through her glove. She felt the particular steadiness of it. The way a hand placed over another hand is a different thing entirely from a hand simply in proximity. She turned her hand over. His fingers closed around hers. Outside, a wood pigeon was making its particular sound in the oak tree at the edge of the garden, and the spring was doing what spring does, quietly and without permission. And the room held two people who had both spent considerable time believing they would not be chosen, sitting with their hands together and no further words that needed to be said. Right now. The county called, of course. The county always calls. Lady Tremaine arranged a dinner at Brambleton Hall 6 weeks after the card party, 30 covers, the invitation making clear it was intended as a proper welcome for the new Countess of Ashcroft. Cecily recognized the shift. In the weeks between, she had been simply herself at morning calls and chance encounters, and had been, apparently, overheard by enough people to constitute a revised opinion. Cecily had not been performing. She had simply been herself, which was the thing she had always been when no one was watching her, and which she had spent most of her life believing was insufficient. The dinner was well managed, and the food was good, and Lady Tremaine's welcome was, if not warm, then substantive, which is a more reliable thing. Cecily sat at the center of the table, where the Countess of Ashcroft was placed by right, and across from her sat Miss Holt, included as someone's ward, who caught Cecily's eye at the soup course and gave her a small, precise nod of the sort that a general might give to a scout returning from favorable terrain. Mrs. Penderton, Cecily had noted, had arrived tonight wearing an expression less certain of itself than usual. At the dessert course, Lady Tremaine said, down the table, with the carrying voice of a woman who knows her ceilings, "Lady Ashcroft, I understand you are restoring the rose garden at Ashcroft House." "I am making a beginning at it," Cecily said, "with considerable help from Lord Ashcroft's niece, who has strong opinions about garden twine." A murmur of appreciation from several quarters. Miss Holt looked satisfied. "Dorothea was fond of the garden," Lady Tremaine said, and the name fell into the dinner with its customary weight, and Cecily saw several faces adjust to see how she would receive it. "She was," Cecily said. "She kept a cutting garden at Marsden Park that she was very particular about." She paused and looked at Lady Tremaine directly. "I imagine you could tell me things about her that I do not know. She was here often enough. I would welcome hearing them." Lady Tremaine was quiet for a moment. "She spoke of you," Lady Tremaine said, and something in her voice had changed, had become less tested, more genuine. "Quite frequently," she said. A pause. "She said you were the one who saw things as they were. She said she relied on it." Cecily felt the familiar tightening in her throat, and held it. "That is," she said, Exactly the kind of thing she would say. Something opened in Lady Tremaine's face, quietly, like a door finally used. The dinner moved on. Later, standing in the front drive in the cool May air, waiting for the carriage to be brought, the Earl of Ashcroft came to stand beside her, and she was aware of the inch between his arm and hers, in the precise way she was always aware of it now, a warmth that was not contact, and communicated more than contact might have. "You recovered that room," he said. "I did not recover anything," she said. "I simply said what was true." He looked at her. "That," he said, "is what recovery looks like." The carriage came. His hand was at the small of her back for the 3 seconds required to hand her up, which was conventional, entirely conventional, and which she was aware of for the full duration of the drive home. That night the garden was silver under a full moon, and Cecily stood at the window of the library for a while, looking at it. The rose canes arching in the dark, the forget-me-nots a pale blur at their feet. And she thought of Dorothea, who had been practical about sentiment, and who would have had something exact and slightly wicked to say about all of this, and she let herself miss her sister completely, without managing the missing, without organizing it into anything useful, and found that she was, when she finished, still standing upright. She heard the door behind her. He crossed the room without turning the lamp up, which she took to mean he had seen the light under the door and guessed rather than summoned her. And he stood beside her at the window, 2 feet away, looking at the garden. "The roses will bloom in June," she said. "Mrs. Farrow says so. I intend to be there when they do." "I know." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the garden still, his profile in the moonlight, that pale stone quality. And she thought about the things that had accumulated across 5 weeks, the library and the carriage and the children and the afternoon with the letter and the hand closed around hers, and she thought about honesty, which was what he had asked for first, before anything else. "James," she said. He turned. She was aware of every inch of the space between them, the moonlight, the dark library, the rose garden outside, the house around them, all of it very still and very present. "I did not expect," she said carefully, "to find myself here." His eyes were very steady on hers. "Nor did I," he said. "I am glad," she said, "that I am." He reached up and touched her face, just briefly, just the edge of his thumb at her jaw, the lightest possible contact. And then his hand moved to her hair, and then he was closer, and the space between them was no longer space, and she had just enough presence of mind to think, before she thought nothing in particular. That honesty was, it turned out, a very efficient thing. After, she stood at the window again, his arm around her and her head at his shoulder, and the garden was still silver outside, and the forget-me-nots were still there at the feet of the roses, a small blue irrelevance that was, she thought, precisely right. "She would have liked you," Cecily said. "In the end. She would have been annoyed for approximately a week that you did not choose her immediately. And then she would have liked you very much." He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "I would have liked her also." "I know," Cecily said. She made it very difficult not to. She felt him breathe against her hair. The clock in the hall counted the hour, unhurried, as it had been doing for years before either of them arrived, and would do for years after. The moonlight moved, slightly, the way moonlight does when you are still long enough to notice. The roses outside were budded and waiting, and would, in June, be everything the gardener and the 7-year-old with her garden twine intended them to be. She held the moment and did not ask it to be other than what it was. In the small portrait frame on the desk, Dorothea's face held its expression of warm and particular mischief, the expression of a woman who had known rather a lot about how things work and had always suspected that they would, in the end, work out quite well. If this stayed with you, leave a word in the quiet below. It is good to know you were there. The roses bloomed in June, exactly as promised, and the morning Cecily went out early to cut the first ones, she found Harriet already in the garden, sitting cross-legged on the stone border, waiting, as if she had simply known.